song in which he entertains the notion that Yahweh may be the best God, at least as far as the Israelites are concerned, but he seems to concede that he is not the only God. Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? That's in Moses' song. The notion may be startling to those who regard the Bible as a manifesto of monotheism, but it was commonplace among the polytheists of the ancient world, including even more than a few of the Israelite kings who acknowledged the existence of many gods and goddesses, even if they offered worship only to their own tutelary god. And then he discusses God and his Asherah and the inscription at Kuntilat Arjud about Yahweh and his Asherah. That was on page 30. Now on page 31 he says, "What is significant about the inscription at Kuntilat Arjud and others like it is the confirmation that both the Israelites and the native-dwelling pagans of Canaan embraced the goddess Asherah. Putting aside such cracks in the theological wall of the Torah as the one found in the tale of the sons of the gods, the Hebrew Bible insists that God did not consort with goddesses and does not sire godlings. But the flesh and blood men and women of ancient Israel, like polytheists all over the world and in every age, seem to imagine that deities too came in pairs, male and female, kings and queens, husband and wife, Yahweh and his Asherah." So there's another selection from Jonathan Kirsch discussing this historical context that has been taken out of the Bible, or at least argued against by some of the later prophets, but it was definitely the folk religion of Israel, without question, and not just for a few odd years out, but it has been the religion of Israel for centuries in the ancient world. Raphael Patai, in his magnificent book, The Hebrew Goddess, talks about this. I want to share a selection from him also. Now, Raphael Patai, in his third enlarged edition of The Hebrew Goddess, this is by Wayne State Press, 1990. On page 38, I'm going to basically read some of the summaries of the evidence that he discusses in this entire chapter. A statue of Asherah was set up in the Jerusalem temple itself. He says that on page 38. On page 39, the cult of the goddess Asherah continued among the Hebrews throughout the period of the judges and the kings. Judging from their frequent occurrence, then he discusses these findings of these little figurines, these female figurines, found by the tens of thousands all over Palestine, north and south, east and west. He says, judging from the frequent occurrence of these female figurines, not matched anywhere by the images of male gods, the worship of the goddess must have been extremely popular in all segments of Hebrew society. Now, one of the reasons for her popularity, of course, is the belief that she promoted fertility in women and helped during childbirth. While the worship of Asherah was thus a central feature of popular Hebrew religion in the pre-monarchic period, and her statue stood in many of a local shrine, it remained for King Solomon to introduce her worship into the capital city of Jerusalem. As is well known, the very manner in which Solomon's temple was built in Jerusalem was conducive to the establishment of a polytheistic, syncretistic cult. Solomon's religious proclivities are condemned by the Yahwist historian, who begins his account of Solomon's reign by stating that Solomon loved Yahweh, but the historian feels constrained to add in the same sentence that he nevertheless sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. So Solomon, King Solomon himself, introduced this worship of the mother goddess. On page 41, among the deities whom Solomon worshipped was the goddess of the Sidonians, who is none other than Asherah. We have to keep in mind that in polytheistic cultures, the prevalent tendency was often to identify one god with another, to substitute one god for another. You combine the gods one with another, and you call the god by one name or another, as we know from many examples in the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Hittite, and the Canaanite religions. In any case, there can be little doubt that it was the worship of Asherah, who was already popular among the Hebrews for several generations, which was introduced by Solomon into Jerusalem as part of the cult of the royal household for his Sidonian wife. Skipping over to page 45, Bataille says, the goddess Asherah was worshipped in Israel from the days of the first settlement in Canaan, the Hebrews having taken over the cult of this great mother goddess from the Canaanites. The cult of the Asherah escaped the popular anti-Baal and pro-Yahweh uprising which was led by the prophet Elijah. Elijah took on the priests of Baal and he destroyed them, but he never condemned Asherah. Then finally, to sum it all up on page 50, to sum up this chapter, here's how Bataille says. He says, to sum up, we find that the worship of Asherah, which had been popular among the Hebrew tribes for 3 centuries, this is 300 years, was introduced into the Jerusalem temple by King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, in or about 928 BCE. Her statue was worshipped in the temple for 35 years until King Asa removed it in 893 BCE. Then the statue was restored back to the temple by King Joash in 825 BCE and remained there for a full century until King Hezekiah removed it in 725 BCE. After an absence of 27 years, however, Asherah was back again into the temple. This time it was King Manasseh who replaced her in 698 BC. She remained in the temple for 78 years until the great reformer King Josiah removed her in 620 BCE. Upon Josiah's death 11 years later, in 609 BCE, she was again brought back into the temple, when she remained until it was destroyed 23 years later in 586 BCE. So it appears that of the 370 years during which the Solomonic temple stood in Jerusalem, for no less than 236 years, about 2/3 of the time, the statue of Asherah was present in Solomon's temple and worshipped there. Her worship was a part of the legitimate religion approved and led by the king, the court, and the priesthood, and she was opposed only by a few prophetic voices crying out against it at relatively long intervals. So this is part of the established religion of ancient Israel and the approved religion for centuries. This is part of the historical context of the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Israelite religion, even though a lot of it's been removed, and all of the scholars acknowledge that this has been fought against, and the record has actually been rewritten. I have some wonderful stuff by Susan Ackerman, another very powerful biblical scholar, who notes this. Okay, there's the old camper unit. There's the pickup and there's the camper, and I admit I am spoiled rotten. I'm out here camping at Twin Bridges, and it is a beautiful day. Let me, before I get to Susan Ackerman, this is William P. Brown's doctoral dissertation, Structure, Role, and Ideology in the Hebrew and Greek Texts of Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 3. This is the doctoral dissertation series of the SBL. It's a 1993 source. It's printed by Scholars Press. This is for the Society of Biblical Literature. He's talking about the Rashi commentary of the Hebrew Old Testament, of the Masoretic text. And he says, contrary to the opinions of most exegetes who have attempted the formidable task, it's a formidable task of recounting the history of the interpretation of Genesis 1:1, Paul Schaeffer has uncovered some historical precursors to Rashi's interpretation of Genesis 1:1.